But right now it's star time. The star of the show, James Brown.
Langston Hughes once wrote, "Jazz is one of the inherent expressions of Negro life in America. The eternal tom-tom beating in the Negro soul. The tom-tom of revolt against weariness in a white world." And I'd argue To Pimp a Butterfly continues this revolt. In an interview, Kamasi Washington said this about collaborating on the album. "Music is all connected, like funk is jazz and jazz is funk. Jazz is hip-hop. It's all the same thing, especially American music, especially African American music. It's really one thing." So on this album, there's what I'll call a permeability between all these genres, one that gives it a more collective black perspective, even if the narrative is deeply personal. That permeability mirrors its purpose, this core metaphor of the cocoon and the butterfly, this divided self that must transform and unite, finding black beauty and pride from within an oppressive society. So in the final line of the poem which structures the album, Kendrick states, "Although the butterfly and caterpillar are completely different, they are one and the same. That divide is both internal and external, the internal being epitomized in the self-hatred and self-love of you and I, a reflection of Du Bois's idea on double consciousness. The external divide is seen, for example, at the end of I. You hear Kendrick breaking up a fight in his audience, then giving a speech to unite the community.
Shit for us to come out here and appreciate the little bit of life we got left, dog. On the dead homies, Charlie P, you know that, bro."
He finds unity in blurring these lines, between genres, between mediums, between past and present. With that comes a call to black history, references to Nelson Mandela, James Brown, Charlie Parker. It's stated by Tupac himself at the end.
As a spirit, we ain't even really rapping, we just letting our dead homies tell stories for us.
And here I just want to contextualize a bit of that history and analyze this masterpiece through the lens of the Harlem Renaissance.
The sun's a setting. This is what I'm gonna sing. Sun's a setting. This is what I'm gonna sing. I feel the blues a comin'. I wonder what the blues will bring.
Where Kendrick utilizes poetry to structure his album, Hughes uses blues music within his poetry. In doing so, they not only demonstrate a continuation of black tradition and culture, but also a permeability between high and low art. We see that in the Weary Blues. This poem is about a blues singer, whose lyrics are interspersed between poetic descriptions of his performance. A core element of the Weary Blues is this interconnection between the poetic and musical blues form, which mirrors Hughes' desire to bridge the ignored artistry of low folk art with the academically oriented high art of poetry. So we can call these first lines conventionally poetic. This isn't the singer, it's the internalized lyricism of a distant observer. Meanwhile, the blues lyrics are notably offset. This doesn't just emphasize the contrast of the lines of poetic description, but it also bridges that difference at the same time by mirroring the syncopation of blues music. Syncopation is reliant on this relative difference between the regular expected beat and the actual accented beat.
They've all been what we call straight grooves. So everything is straight, or the beat is straight if it's 1 and 2 and 3. If there's a bounce to it, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, we call it swing, and in blues it's typically known as a blues shuffle.
So, when syncopation is referenced in the first conventionally poetic line, it is then portrayed and completed with this line, when the narrator hears the singer. The connection to the blues form is more obvious when he repeats this offset line.
He did a lazy sway. He did a lazy sway to the tune of those weary blues.
Then, of course, Hughes presents the blues song itself, as Arnold Rampersad puts it, with minimal interference from conventional white poetic values.
Most of my poems are written that way. They're what you might call spontaneous or improvisational poems, I guess. I'm not the kind of poet who studies and ponders and works in strict forms, and I'm not against writing in the sonnet form or the rondo or whatever forms you may be able to master. It just hasn't happened to be my way of writing.
Note how Negro is capitalized. This capitalization invokes a trope of the collective black experience, which is explored in Hughes' poem, also called Negro. It's the first poem in the original collection and precedes the eponymous w.e.b. blues. Here the narrator proclaims, "I am a Negro, black as the night is black." They continue through time and place as a slave, a worker, a singer, a victim, and again, a Negro. Altogether, they form this collective black history made up by equal parts oppression and individual experience. And part of that is explicitly musical, sorrow songs, and ragtime. So going back to the w.e.b. blues, this collective experience is only completed by the connection between the higher class poet, represented in the narrator, and the common folk counterpart, represented in the blues singer. And let me narrow down what I mean by the relative terms high, low, or common, because I don't mean it in a derogatory way. In Hughes' essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, he writes, "There are the low-down folks, the so-called common element, and they are the majority, may the Lord be praised. These common people are not afraid of spirituals, as for a long time their more intellectual brethren were, and jazz is their child. They furnish a wealth of colorful, distinctive material for any artist, because they still hold their own individuality in the face of American standardizations. And perhaps these common people will give to the world its truly great Negro artist, the one who was not afraid to be himself." He went on saying that these common people accept what beauty is their own without question. Critic Stephen Tracy writes that this statement shows Hughes's black middle-class target audience that needed a legitimate literary artist to sanction the folk materials for them. In other words, the common people don't need proof that folk art is art. They already know. They're making it and listening to it. So Hughes writes, "Let the blare of Negro jazz bands and the bellowing voice of Bessie Smith singing the blues penetrate the closed ears of the colored nigger intellectuals until they listen and perhaps understand." Hence, the permeability of the w.e.b. blues is a means of convincing that middle-class poetry-reading audience to understand the beauty of these folk materials. Consequently, the role of the poetic narrator of the w.e.b. blues is just to listen. So the narrator only says "I" when it quotes the singer, or only to say "I heard" while the singer takes center stage. Hughes even takes it a step further in his later work, Fine Clothes to the Jew, a collection of poetry that's often just a transcription of the blues, no narrator needed. Just to be clear, this was controversial among white and black critics alike. The idea that folk art, like the blues, is just as artistic, if not more, because of its blackness and because it's of the common people. In his autobiography, Hughes recounts the headlines of black newspapers. Langston Hughes' Book of Poems, Trash, Langston Hughes, The Sewer Dweller. Benjamin Brawley wrote, "No other book ever issued reflects more fully the abandon and the vulgarity of its age." A big part of this is the characters he represented. See, the Harlem Renaissance was also called the New Negro Movement. The overly shortened version is that this is a transformation by reinterpretation, a conscious effort to uplift the race as a whole, often through art, redefine what it means to be black in America, which had long been defined only through harmful stereotypes, the likes of Jim Crow or Birth of a Nation. And these stereotypes were being used to justify lynchings or attacks like the Tulsa Massacre. So there was tension even within the movement about what it meant to be new. A lot of artists lean towards an educated, refined image to break those stereotypes. You can see this in the characters of Within Our Gates, the earliest known surviving feature film directed by an African American. Hughes' writing, like the blues, didn't focus on the moral uplift of such characters. He wrote about black servants, prostitutes, the poor and destitute as they were, and not as they supposedly should be. He tried to capture the beauty of the dialect, called them "my people" in one poem. In that autobiography, he responds to these ideas, writing, "In anything that white people were likely to read, black critics and intellectuals wanted to put their best foot forward, their politely polished and cultural foot, and only that foot. I didn't know the upper-class Negroes well enough to write much about them. I knew only the people I had grown up with, and they weren't people whose shoes were always shined, who had been to Harvard, or who had heard of Bach. They seemed to me good people too." Hence The Racial Mountain, where he celebrates black art without casting away blackness. He lays out the difficulty in navigating this dynamic. "Oh, be respectable, write about nice people, show how good we are," say the Negroes. Be stereotyped. Don't go too far. Don't shatter our illusions about you. Don't amuse us too seriously. We will pay you, say the whites.
And we hate the popo, want to kill us in the street, faux show. KG.
Ah, please. Ugh, I don't like it. I mean, you know I don't like it. That's why he came to me. I get it. That's his right to express himself. Let the free market decide. Personally, it doesn't excite me. It doesn't turn me on. Doesn't interest me. I'm not feeling it.
Harlem, not helpful with those song lyrics.
To say the least, not helpful at
Disrespectful.
all. This is why I say that hip-hop has done more damage to young African Americans than racism in recent years. This is exactly the wrong message.
So Hughes puts away those notions. He makes blues poetry. He makes jazz poetry, continuing that tom-tom of revolt against weariness in a white world. And that weariness is all-encompassing. In the Weary Blues, that weariness is felt from the low-down singer to the middle-class poet. Just like the poem first connects dark skin to night, to slavery, and eventually sorrow songs and ragtime, the references to nighttime in the Weary Blues also contain this sorrowful connotation of black oppression and history, eventually leading to the blues. Like this line about night against a pale, pallor light. Black weariness in a white world. A light cast over Lenox Avenue. That duality extends to the musicality as the singer has his ebony hands on each ivory key. At the end of the poem, that duality extends over all the world and then disappears with the lines, "Far into the night he crooned that tune. The stars went out and so did the moon." The permeability of the poem is again reflected in the penultimate line as the weary blues echo through his head, showing how the blues have begun from the low-down singer to the listening poet, who imagines its continuation long after the performance is over. For both of them, the weary blues carries a sort of intangibility. It's the name of the poem, it's the song, it's also a feeling, the blues.
You know, one of the basics of jazz is that basic beat, which just sort of goes marching on, pounding on, rhythmically dancing on, in spite of everything, in spite of all the hardships and difficulties of life, because jazz is the happiest, the most conducive to dancing, to movement, to laughter, to life of any music anywhere, and it's loved all around the world. And then, of course, it has its sad side through the blues. But under the sadness of the blues, there's always this determination, this marching on, this basic beat that keeps you living.
Hughes calls it ironic laughter mixed with tears. It's a celebration in the face of oppression, an oppression that isn't directly stated, but it's felt by both the narrator and singer. But I want to go back to this line, "When the stars went out." See, for Hughes, stars are one of the recurring motifs in his poetry. Maybe it's a white world, a dream just out of reach. Maybe its absence speaks to the homeland in Africa. One example is his Ballad of the Seven Songs, subtitled A Poem for Emancipation Day. The 7 songs correspond to 7 figures chasing freedom, a dream represented by the North Star. Each has a song as they get closer. He writes, "To Cujo, slave, only a dream belonged. 7 letters spelled the dream, Freedom. Sometimes freedom seems so far away, farther away than the farthermost star." He quotes an African-American spiritual, says this is Cujo's song. He writes, "Death was a deep river, and only over the river Jordan. Across the great dark sea, star, guide thou me." Then Harriet Tubman, she could not read the word nor spell the word, but she smelled the word, tasted the word, on the north wind heard the word, and she saw it in a star. For her, he quotes another song. Then he writes of Sojourner Truth, again, the stars, her children, the same song again. He writes, "Home was not heaven, but the north. North, North Star, North." Frederick Douglass called his paper the North Star. He goes on tracing history past the Emancipation Proclamation. But not all the free are free. Still, it's a long step from Cujo, slave, from Harriet Tubman, slave, Sojourner Truth, slave, Frederick Douglass, slave, who had to run away to freedom. It's a long step to Booker T. Washington, to Dr. W.e.b. Du Bois, building a culture for America. It's a long step from Cujo, slave, hoeing cotton, to George Washington Carver, once slave, giving his discoveries in agricultural chemistry to the world. It's a long song from "Before I'd Be a Slave, I'd Be Buried in My Grave" to Dorothy Maynard singing "Depuis le jour." It's a long step from Cujo, slave, to Jackie Robinson hitting a homer. Yet to some, freedom is still only part of a word. Some of the letters are missing. Yet it's enough of a word to lay hands on and hope. It's enough of a word to be a universal star, not just a North Star anymore. Now to Kendrick Lamar. What does it mean when his album starts like this? This is a sample of Boris Gardner's song. After the massive success of Good Kid, Mad City, Kendrick became a huge star. But To Pimp a Butterfly questions whether he's any closer to that promise of the American dream. Kendrick navigates this dynamic between celebrity and freedom. It's asking if he can be that guiding light, if he can present this innate beauty to and from within a collective black audience. Now, the very process of sampling contains an inherent sense of permeability. Like the Weary Blues, there's a continuation of musical tradition, like those spirituals that seep in and out of the history and Ballad of the Seven Songs. Here, Gardner's Prideful Soul song from 1973 is recontextualized as an intro to Kendrick's hip-hop album of 2015. Listen to how a Ninth Wonder talks about the art of sampling.
I'm just doing what Pete did for me. Pete and Preem did for me and what James Brown did for them. It's still just a paying it forward. I just always look at it as a link in the chain, man. Like, it's a link in the chain. The sample came from 3 different countries with 3 different generations, 3 different genres, covering all parts of Kendrick's life.
Another link in the chain. That kind of permeability blurs the lines between musical genres. The sample even ends with James Brown's classic line. But the sample's racial epithet characterizes the oppression surrounding Kendrick's intention. Later in I, he raps explicitly about a more conscious understanding of the N-word directly to a live audience.
Negus, definition, royalty, king royalty.
So this desire to uplift the community, to find and present freedom and pride, comes into conflict with Kendrick's personal doubts and fallibility. So the sample just cuts out, and Joseph Lineberg introduces the album's extended metaphor. Unlike Hughes, who claims the common people will accept what beauty is their own in the form of their truly great Negro artist, Kendrick carries a deeply divisive pressure to show this beauty within himself and his community of the common people. That self-doubt is also reflected in the first line of the spoken word poem.
I remember you was conflicted.
The form of the poem also reflects this internal conflict. It's told in fragments, slowly revealing itself and becoming more whole over the course of the album. This permeability between mediums mirrors the Weary Blues. Even the titles blur this line of high and low. While the song is called Mortal Man, implying a fallen angel, something prophetic and biblical, the poem contained within is called something else.
I was gonna call it another nigga, but it ain't really a poem. I just felt like it's something you probably could relate to.
But a major distinction is found in their intended audience, where Hughes translates the beauty of low-down blues to the high art of poetry for the black middle class. Kendrick does the reverse, bringing poetry into hip-hop for the purpose of uplifting the common people. And so Kendrick's poem mentions his desire to go back to the city and tell the homies what I learned, reflected also in the final lines of the album.
Finally free. The butterfly sheds light on situations that the caterpillar never considered, ending the internal struggle.
In this sense, the moral and political imperative Kendrick places on his own artistry begins to mirror that of the new Negro movement, transformation by reinterpretation, trying to redefine what it means to be black in America, and what it means to be finally free. Kendrick sees this role as a black leader too. He says in an interview, "They're following you, and every mistake that you make, they're going to make the same mistakes." In To Pimp a Butterfly, these mistakes originate from the many temptations introduced in Wesley's theory. While Good Kid, Mad City reflected Kendrick's conscious narrative of growing up in Compton, To Pimp a Butterfly speaks to his return. The first verse depicts Kendrick's indulgence in stereotypically masculine hip-hop tropes after he gets signed to a label, buying a brand new caddy, a few M16s, a Cuban link, all with his newfound wealth. These tropes are complicated in the second verse, which reveals the offer of Uncle Sam, who asks,
"What you want? You a house, you a car, 40 acres and a mule, a piano, a guitar, anything. Say my name is Uncle Sam on your dog."
So in those lines, the pimp of the album title is America, which offers the false promise of upward mobility and freedom represented by the 40 acres and a mule. The work and value of the black artist, established through a piano, a guitar, is then under the threat of being pimped out as they sell their values for the false pursuit of material gain. This should sound familiar. Later in All Right, the same lines come from Lucy, or Lucifer, so these are also the false temptations of the devil. Altogether, it's not just describing this relationship between America and the black individual, but also between artist and label, especially in these lines.
I can see the dollar in you. I can see the dollar in you. Little white lies, but there's no white collar in you.
The first line is framed like Uncle Sam gassing him up, seeing his potential, but its potential made up by actual currency, by commercial value. All the stuff he might buy, the piano, the guitar, gators. That's also what it means to be a baller, to spend needlessly without checking the receipts. So saying, I can see the dollar in you, it's not just about seeing Kendrick's worth, not just the money that's mutually made from a record deal. It's also about the money that can be extracted from him, whether it's by a shady record contract or all the many commercial temptations described previously. Either way, those are all little white lies, emphasis on white. The idea is expanded on later in How Much a Dollar Cost. Instead of Lucifer, it's God as a homeless man asking for $1, trying to get Kendrick to relinquish the temptations of greed and judgment. But this line also denotes slavery and being pimped out, as in, I can see how much you're worth, bought and sold. It's made more clear in the next line with another play on words. It's no white collar in you, which is to say, it's not a white person collaring you. Another white lie. It's also white collar as in a white collar job, one that would typically require a formal education. As one previous line goes,
Uneducated, but I got $1 million check like that.
and later he raps,
But remember, you ain't passed economics in school, and everything you buy, Texas will deny how Wesley sniped your ass before 35.
So even with financial success, black stars like Wesley Snipes are predisposed to fail because of a skewed system which includes a lacking education. This also hurts any political attempt to change that system, which is why the lines reference the White House and age 35, the required age to be president.
The one other colored pupil in the class, a girl, said to me, we don't have to worry about that old class election. She said they never elect Negroes to anything in these schools here anyway. And it turned out she was just about right. She'd been in the class for the whole 8th grades and had never had a class office of any kind because Lincoln at that time was a kind of small American town where if you were colored, on the way home from school, you couldn't get a hot dog. If you went to the movies, they had one row, a half a row really, on the left, reserved for Negroes. I don't know why they always put us on the left, but they did. So that was the kind of town Lincoln, Illinois was at that time, named after the great emancipator. Well,
By switching between himself and Uncle Sam or Lucifer on these tracks, there's also the aforementioned theme of double consciousness. W.e.b. Du Bois coined the term in his work, The Souls of Black Folk. He describes it as the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One never feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And so Kendrick raps,
Gemini, 2 sides, so you better cop everything 2 times. 2 coops, 2 chains, 2 C-notes, too much and enough, both we know.
and this comes from the American side of his consciousness, literally as Uncle Sam with his false promises, rapping about the literal things that black men and artists should supposedly strive towards. And those things will never be enough to reconcile that internal conflict. Du Bois continues, the history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. And I think Kendrick captures this idea in the album's main metaphor, this internal divide, the cocoon which merges into a better and truer self in the butterfly. We see this internal divide and transformation even just in the titles of the tracks You and I, one song on self-hatred, another on self-love. Though, in Du Bois's words, we also see a commonality with Hughes's racial mountain. Where Hughes admired the common people's individuality in the face of American standardizations, Du Bois writes more generally, he would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. And so in All Right, Kendrick turns away from that flood of white Americanism, the identical offers of Lucifer and Uncle Sam. That same verse ends,
I rap, I'm black on tracks, so rest assured. My rights, my wrongs, I right till I'm right with God.
Here there's a play on being back on track. In the context of the verse, he's resolved to turn away the offers of Lucifer. But in the context of the album as a whole, All Right comes right after You, a song that actualizes Du Bois's double self, which turns to self-hatred and eventually suicidal ideation.
You should have filled that black revolver blast long time ago. And if this marriage could talk, it'd say you gotta go.
So All Right is Kendrick's resolution to push on with his lead into the chorus, which goes,
My knees getting weak and my gun might blow, but we gon' be alright.
But there's also another meaning in the wordplay of these two phrases. I rap but black and I write till I'm right. I think the second phrase helps explain the first one. For Kendrick, to write leads to righteousness. Likewise, to rap is to embrace blackness, on track, as in a musical track. He expands on this in the track Mama, which connects his childhood where he was learning to rap in Compton to his arrival in Africa, both being called home.
Thank God for rap. I would say it got me a plaque, but what's better than that? The fact it brought me back home.
So in the title and this chorus, there's the connection to his mother, but also the motherland. The song ends with a frantic verse about someone without this connection.
I've been looking for you my whole life, and every time for the feeling I can barely describe what you reside.
And so in You Ain't Gotta Lie, Mama said, we see that connection guide him away from the stereotypical masculine values offered by Uncle Sam and Lucifer. Where Wesley's theory had indulgences like a little secretary bitch, platinum on everything, a few M16s, his mom's lesson has him taking apart that male bravado.
The hoes at to impress me. Ask when the money bags to impress me. Say you got the burner stash to impress me.
We see that African connection extend to the title of Complexion, a Zulu love. Again, there's a sense of permeability. He's blurring the lines of country and colorism. Like Hughes's ballad, he's drawing from the history of slavery to tell a story of unity. That's reflected in Rhapsody's verse, which goes from Tupac to Solomon Northup, from the real blues to Jay's Baby. For Kendrick, we start to get an overview on the values that combat that flood of white Americanism. His connections to God, hip-hop, to his community, and here, home, his family, and Africa. Of course, Hughes cared about that African connection too. If you recall in Prom, there's the singer who carries sorrow songs all the way from Africa to Georgia, and he connects white colonial violence in the Congo to lynchings in Texas, this shared pain and pride. Through that, both Kendrick and Hughes attempt to unite that fragmented history and heritage, maybe in part getting closer to merging that fragmented double self termed by Du Bois. Of course, actually finding that resolution isn't quite so simple.
It's a poem called My People. The night is beautiful, so the faces of my people. The stars are beautiful, so the eyes of my people. Beautiful also is the sun. Beautiful also are the souls of my people. That's the way the African people seem to me, and that's the way my brothers and sisters in America have always seemed to me.
In Black to the Berry, Kendrick even describes a violent divide within Africa itself. The title and refrain reference Tupac's Keep Your Head Up.
Some say the blacker the better, the sweeter the juice. I say the darker the flesh, then the deeper the roots.
As well as Wallace Thurman's The Blacker the Berry. But the song doesn't offer the hopeful pride of either. In this track, we see all that built-up self-hatred brought to the forefront. An explosion, like the dream deferred. It's a song of righteous fury towards an unjust system, but at the same time of internalized anger, the other American self that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Kendrick is seemingly confronting the entrapments of racial stereotypes as he lashes out at America. But it's not like the track DNA, where he kind of battles these stereotypes with lines like, which is countered by, it doesn't sample then frame a racist like Geraldo Rivera as the ignorant enemy. So every verse starts, I'm the biggest hypocrite of 2015, and repeats, you hate me, don't you? In his thesis, Jacob Silliman expands on this observation, describing how you is at first some figure of oppression, whether it be a white individual, white America, a white listener, or possibly a nebulous power structure. He continues, Lamar is agonized by his own feelings of guilt, so much so that the you he addresses with such contempt can shift imperceptibly between referring to the enemy and to himself. The speaker in the song is pulled in these different directions, and so too is the listener, unsure where political manifesto and personal reflection separate. I'd argue further that Kendrick also implies another you in the black community, which is where it starts to seem problematic. Take these lines.
I can tell cause your waist deceitful. No, I can tell because you in love with the desert eagle. Thinking maliciously, he get a chain, then you gon' bleed him.
Here, the implied you who would steal this chain is reminiscent of the friend from Compton and Institutionalized. He comes with Kendrick to the BET Awards, sees all the rich black celebrities as walking licks. He even raps about having the same .44 caliber pistol, but you can also be the enemy gang, as implied by the lines that come immediately after, comparing Zulu and Kosa to Compton Crip gangs, beefing with Pyrus. In which case, as Kendrick raps, you hate my people can be taken as my gang, cause it's threats when I see you. But there's still a bit of misdirection, as Sillyman calls it. Like Kendrick says here, I can tell cause your way's deceitful. So if we take you to still mean a deceitful white America, then there's this sort of double meaning with loving the desert eagle. And the double meaning of the chain is outlined in the chorus by Assassin. These gold chains reflect the offers of Uncle Sam and Wesley's theory, this commercialized, unattainable standard of wealth marketed towards black men. Assassin frames it as striving towards a gaudy, heavy reflection of enslavement. He does the same with whips as cars in the next line. So going back to these lines, if we assume he's speaking to America, we can interpret this to mean, because of a violent love of country or patriotism, the eagle, black men are maliciously chained, then bled, and how they are bled is answered in the lines right after, about Compton gangs. Kendrick contextualizes gang crime as an effect of American oppression, just like those oppressive gold chains, oppression that is then internalized within the individual, whether that's Kendrick or the community. As Kendrick raps in verse 1,
You sabotage my community, making a killing. You made me a killer, emancipation of a real nigga.
So white America profits off of that violence which is answered in the final lines.
Why did I weep when Trayvon Martin was in the street? When gang banging make me kill a nigga blacker than me, hypocrite.
This is a controversial moment. On its face, it's equating hate crime, an act of oppression, to black-on-black crime, a symptom of oppression. It seems to follow his even more controversial and frankly tone-deaf statement about the murder of Michael Brown by police. When this track dropped as a single, Stereo Williams wrote, "It's not even necessary to mention the two disparate social ills in the same context unless it's to recognize the multifaceted attack on poor black youth by a system that despises them. K-Dot sounds ready for war on the verses, but I hate the way he turns his gun on himself and his people." But this article was written before the album itself. I'd argue altogether it does have that awareness of that multifaceted attack by a system that despises them. Even in the song itself, the lines I just mentioned seem to point towards the true cause, which would be white America. The final phrase references the Emancipation Proclamation, this false promise of freedom. That oppressive falsehood is furthered in the racial epithet, similar to his usage of the Boris Gardner sample. Like Hughes wrote in his poem for Emancipation Day, not all the free are free. But then there's that ambiguous you again. Here, the word you can still be interpreted to reference the black community, as if Kendrick could be saying, it's your fault, you're sabotaging all of us just to get ahead and make money. Think again of that friend in Institutionalized. He's saying, you forced my hand, forced me to continue the cycle of violence. The album as a whole is so much about Kendrick's internalized oppression, self-hatred, that when that last statement drops, it gets further away from the anthemic political message seen in All Right and closer to representing that internal divide, double consciousness, showing how that divide becomes external, violent, and cyclical. He raps,
You hate me, don't you? I know you hate me just as much as you hate yourself, jealous of my wisdom and cards I dealt.
Is he calling out the insecurity inherent to racism, that desperate need to feel superior? Or the victims of racism, who are systematically made to feel inferior? Which takes me to my next point. Is he speaking as America or to America? He has rapped as Uncle Sam, after all. And if the word you is ambiguous because it might refer to himself, then the word I is also unclear. As I said before, he's often speaking through that lens of the internalized American self, so he portrays himself through stereotype. Consider this line from verse 1.
I'm African American, I'm African, I'm black as the moon, heritage of a small village, part of my residence.
Obviously, there's this contradiction in being black as the moon, as opposed to being black as the night, like in Hughes's poem. In the Weary Blues, the moon was the white half of this duality of black weariness in a white world. Here, that white world is internalized. In verse 3, Kendrick raps,
I'm African American, I'm African, I'm black as the heart of a fucking Aryan.
Again, we see the two halves of that double self confusingly juxtaposed. We can interpret this like an equation. These two phrases are, in a way, repetitions. The phrase, I'm African American, is meant to be restated by the other part. I'm African. I'm American. So the phrases, I'm black as the moon, or I'm black as the heart of a fucking Aryan, represent this American half of being African American. Drawing a line to Nazism speaks to the heart of all that self-hatred which begins in white supremacy, double consciousness, an American, a Negro, two warring ideals in one dark body. The ambiguous I is also seen in the intro. He says, everything black, want all things black, referencing the famous all black everything line from Jay-Z. And possibly even the follow-up songs by Rhapsody or Lupe Fiasco. Either way, these references are subverted at the end of the intro as he says, I own black, own everything black, which mirrors the ownership of black people by America. It also preempts the commercialized things in the chorus, where Jay-Z frames the black fatigues, cards, and cars as emblems of Rock Nation. Assassin frames gold chains and whips as symbols of slavery. So oddly, this really is an apt description. He is turning the gun on himself, like he does in You. In the same moment he's turning the gun on the community, he's completing the cycle of self-hatred which manifests outward. He's representing that internal struggle of being this guiding light, the star, struggling to live up to Mandela, to Tupac, to the word of God just to bring it back to the community. And on this track he just can't. Where All Right holds on hope, Blacker the Berry ends with Kendrick overcome with hatred. Again, the two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Well, this is Kendrick being torn asunder. This moment makes you ask, is Kendrick's guilt and self-hatred an effect of his violence against his own community, or is that act of violence against his community the effect of self-hatred? Either way, he still traces it back to America, to those deceitful ways, to those institutionalized manipulation and lies, later revealed to be the cocoon in the poem, the city, his thoughts, a cage that is both internal and external.
And this is a poem about them called Crowns and Garlands. Make a garland of Leontines and Ninas and hang it about your neck like a lei. Make a crown of Sammys, Sydneys, Harrys, plus Cassius Muhammad Ali Clay. Put their laurels on your brow today. Then, before you can walk to the neighborhood corner, watch them droop, wilt, fade away. Though worn in glory on my head, they do not last a day, not one, nor take the place of meat or bread or rent that I must pay. Great names for crowns and garlands, yea. I love Ralph Bunch, but I can't eat him for lunch.
The track Institutionalized elaborates more on this cage. Mike Seatown of Dead End Hip Hop explains the title in the review.
I loved Institutionalized, and I thought that was really interesting, the idea of it being institutionalized, but then you can tell he's saying institutional lies. And I really didn't get it at first, but once I heard the whole line about college and the whole idea of dream is a dream unless work follows it, I was like, okay, it's institutional lies. That's pretty deep.
The track is framed like an argument. One versus Kendrick, one versus an old friend from Compton. The intro lays out the conflict.
I'm trapped inside the ghetto and I ain't proud to admit it. Institutional lies, I keep running back for a visit. Hold up.
At a glance, the first part represents Kendrick, the star who is visiting Compton, and so the second part represents his friend who is ready to rob the other celebrities at the BET Awards. Of course, with the context of Blacker the Berry, the second part is still relevant to Kendrick, as Snoop says at the end,
You can take your boy out the hood, but you can't take the hood off the homie.
but calling it a visit implies Kendrick doesn't realize this. He's coming off King Kunta, where he's on top. He made it. He's rich and untouchable, though the title obviously foreshadows a fall. He plays up this carefree cockiness in his delivery, referencing the classic Forrest Gump line with a bit of a twist. Instead of, you never know what you're gonna get, it's quid pro quo, a transaction where he seemingly knows exactly what he's gonna get. It's an echo of For Free or Wesley's theory. He's buying into something without really knowing the price. Buying into those institutional lies.
Be all you can be, true, but the problem is a dream, only a dream. If work, don't follow it.
So it's that simple. Work hard, be successful. That's what Forrest Gump does.
Now, because I'd been a football star and a war hero and national celebrity and a shrimping boat captain, and a college graduate, he got me invested in some kind of fruit company. And so then I got a call from him saying, we don't have to worry about money no more. And I said, that's good. One less thing.
Of course, Forrest is colorblind too. He doesn't see race, he never questions anything.
What's your sole purpose in this army?
To do whatever you tell me, drill sergeant.
Meanwhile, the Black Panther Party is just another historical footnote to trace his story. Bubba's family history of black servitude is solved by white philanthropy, and Jenny, the counterculture hippie, struggles her whole life until she dies to Hep C. And that's the American dream. In this song, that's what Kendrick did. He worked hard, escaped Compton, the Mad City. He can laugh at his spoiled, struggling friends who never learned the same lesson. Like Forrest, it's the lesson repeated by this motherly figure, though it's not so sweet.
Shit don't change until you get up and wash your ass, nigga.
It's a spin on change comes from within. Of course, in the song, Kendrick doesn't realize the lesson applies to him, and it's not about following the guidelines of the American dream. By the end of the album, his lesson is to understand the cocoon, the institutional lies, these walls, the modes of separation that are both internal and external. That is, to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better, truer self. To finally understand that the butterfly and caterpillar are one and the same, in a way where neither of the older selves are lost. To not forget his roots in this mad city, the people who are still struggling, the friend and institutionalized, or the characters of Good Kid, Mad City, the homeless man and How Much a Dollar Cost, or the African kid in Mama. To finally replace self-hatred with self-love, and for him, that is the means of uniting the community. Of course, it's a stretch to ask rival gang members to love thy neighbor, and that's why I think he chose the word respect at the end of the album. It's more feasible, and it's less about respectability and more unity by necessity, to fight the common enemy.
A learning process. Sometimes I started thinking about some of the actions going to be taken against me and other members of the party, and I said, I don't know why I'm not scared. But you know what I define as being? I define as being a people high. I define as being high off the people. You high? I'm high. You understand what I'm saying? I'm high off the people. Send me away to the penitentiary, and I went to the penitentiary way down in Menard, Illinois. I'm thinking, I said, well, I'm way down here in the country. I might can't hear no people. When I got to Menard, I myself, even being in the vanguard, had to get on my knees and learn from the people. I had to put my ear to the ground. And when I put my ear to the ground, I heard it beat.
In light of this, it's appropriate to highlight Kendrick's moment of self-acceptance, which he offers to the community in the song I. The song is a notable departure from the rest of the album due to its emulated live performance. The decision to use this version instead of the already released studio single highlights the importance that Kendrick places on the community itself, beyond the individual. They're literally in the music. He repeats multiple times, interrupting verses to say, "Come to the front," reflecting his desire to pull the people to the forefront of the album and bring this message of self-love. He still carries double consciousness. There's this apt metaphor of the dirty double mirror, a dirty reflection of his inner self, but there's more awareness than in the track You. He's implying a two-way mirror, an interrogation room with a cop sitting on the other side, the entrapment of oppression vandalizing his perception. But here he sees through it.
Look at me, what do you see?
With I comes I Too, the poem that bookends the weary blues. Hughes calls to America directly as the poem begins, I too sing America. Like Kendrick, there's a recording that changed a little bit from the original release. This line, from I to we, again emphasizing the people over the individual. The poem is also a response to Walt Whitman and his poem, I Hear America Singing. And like Hughes, Whitman was a poet of the people, but a specific set of people. Whitman's poem speaks to the beauty of the common working man in the form of the carpenter, the mason, the boatman, and so on. Altogether, their melodies are one song, the song of America. While in I Too, Hughes vocalizes the song of the darker brother, the black servant. In contrast to Whitman's long, flowing lines, Hughes gives shorter ones, which carry an innate power and beauty in their brevity. And his is the song that often goes unheard. But one day he will grow strong.
Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I, too, am America.
In The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois introduces double consciousness with a question. How does it feel to be a problem? Headlines of the time asserted this problematic existence, the burden of white society in acclimating these newly freed slaves, hence the self-willed transformation of the new Negro movement, one which often drew from Africa for inspiration. Kendrick does the same with his explanation straight from Ethiopia, from a problem to a movement, from an infamous slur to an assertion of pride. It's a long step from caterpillar to butterfly, from the weary blues to Nina Simone's Ode to Hughes.
He said, Nina, keep on working till they open up the door now.
From Strange Fruit to Rhapsody's Ode to Nina with Blood at the Root. It's a long step from Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition to hood politics, from Wallace Thurman to Tupac, from the North Star to Boris Gardner. It's a long song from I Hear America Singing to I Too Sing America, from I Too to I, henceforward and forever free.
I'm gonna leave you with the blues, yeah.
Make some noise for yourself right now.
So, I went down to the river. I sat down on the bank. I tried to think, but couldn't, so I jumped in and sank. I came up once and hollered. I came up twice and cried. If that water hadn't been so cold, I might have sunk and died. But it was cold in that water. It was cold. The next day I took the elevator 16 floors above the ground. I thought about my baby, and I thought I would jump down. I stood there and I hollered. I stood there and I cried. If it hadn't been so high up there, you know, I might have jumped and died. But it was high up there. It was high. So, since I'm still here living, I guess I will live on. I could have died for love, but for living I was born. Though you may hear me holler, and you may see me cry, I'll be dog, sweet baby, if you're gonna see me die.